Right, welcome back to our Critical Decolonial Social Psychology YouTube channel, or our short videos. We're standing here in front of the, which is actually the Adam Small building. It's an interesting piece of change at Stellenbosch University. This used to be the H.B. Tom building, the whole building. Now the theatre is still called the H.B. Tom. Now the H.B. Tom was a former Vice Chancellor of Stellenbosch University. I'm not sure, I think it was the 1940s perhaps. Prominent Afrikaner intellectual and a Vice Chancellor of Stellenbosch University. And then I think 2 years ago, just before COVID, this building was changed into the Adam Small building. You can't see the name up there. So that was another sort of moment of symbolic change, I guess, at Stellenbosch. And it's an interesting story in the politics of naming. It's an attempt to change the physical landscape of Stellenbosch University. Now, Small himself, of course, is a very important Afrikaans poet, but he wrote in Kaaps, which for a long time was a sort of a less prestigious, perhaps still less prestigious, seen as a dialect of Afrikaans, but people are now claiming it, of course, as a separate language. So this links very nicely with the theme of today's seminar. So as you know, we are discussing Frantz Fanon's work with our students, with you guys. And today we focused on the first chapter of Black Skin, White Masks, which is called The Negro and Language. And Fanon there problematizes the relationship of the colonized with the colonial language, in his case French, and he shows to what extent inhabiting or using French becomes a necessary requirement to be seen or recognized as human, but at the same time French becomes an instrument of alienation. One is almost necessarily alienated from oneself, one's capacity to name the world, to converse with people, because of one's having to navigate the world in a colonial language. And in this, Fanon wrote this chapter, which is an extraordinary chapter really, long before the development of most of what today is called social linguistics, but he touches on all the things, the politics of naming, of accent, of the colonial language in relation to indigenous languages and so on. And he, I think, very successfully shows how this kind of macro politics of language is internalized and people relate to themselves in ways that, Fanon talks about an amputation of being, which is one of the ways, just something that is severely felt, I think, in one's relationship to a language. So I think it's more than just a kind of opening chapter to this important book, White Skin, White Masks. I think this chapter on the Negro and Language opens up a whole debate, an ongoing debate about what happens to language after colonization. In this country, what happens to language after apartheid, for example. So we have a long colonial history, apartheid history, where languages have been instrumentalized differently, incorporated in different identity politics, used to group people together and to get them to sort of invest in those ethno-linguistic identities, and also used as instruments of exclusion, of driving people apart, right? So apartheid was very much a sort of ethno-linguistic system of ethno-linguistic differences, not just racial differences, but using language to symbolically, but also in practice, separate people and so on. Now this raises a number of issues that Fanon does not address in his book, specifically the question of multilingualism or plurilingualism, however you want to call that. How do we live with linguistic difference? How do we deal with linguistic difference, especially in a system where all these languages are not equal in terms of status, in terms of the power that they've accrued throughout the colonial history, the apartheid history in our case. What do we do? Like, do we, practically speaking, South Africa has, as you know, 11 official languages. Does it mean that we treat all those languages as equal? Should we adopt one language as a kind of neutral language? Is there such a thing as a neutral language? So these are all questions that we started discussing with in the seminar today, and it's not questions that Fanon could answer, right? But I think these are really important questions as we think about something like English. Is clearly not simply a neutral language, right? And the indigenous languages too are not entirely outside. They're not something that precedes colonialism, because colonialism also utilized these languages to create fictions, ethno-linguistic fictions again. The Bible was translated in different African languages in order to create a sense of community. So it's also not as simple as saying multilingualism is a good thing, because multilingualism itself is something that has a kind of colonial baggage. Right, so these are questions we're going to continue discussing as we run through Fanon's book. We'll see you next time.